Nebuchadnezzar was a cruel pagan king. He was incredibly cruel. He was ruthless. He was cruel to everyone that he conquered, not just the Israelites. That was one group of people, or Judah. That was one group of people that he had conquered, but he had conquered a lot of different nations. He was the top king of that era. He was persistent in battle. There was one case that I was reading about where he laid siege against this city for 13 years. Just camped outside the city until they gave up. For 13 years. He would not, when he had started a battle, he would not stop until he won. That was the kind of king that he was. If you read in 2 Kings 25, there's some examples in there of absolute cruelty. You can go back to that later on, but you'll see some examples of what King Nebuchadnezzar did to Israel after what we read about in Daniel chapter 1. After that happened, when they rebelled against him, the people that he left back in Jerusalem, when they rebelled against him, he did some crazy stuff to them. You can go back to 2 Kings 25 if you're interested in that. But just to understand how cruel King Nebuchadnezzar was. When he defeated a city, it would be often completely destroyed, or at the very least populated by people that he would bring in, so that he would have control over the people that were there, the people that were faithful to him. He would practice mass deportations of people that were in the nations that he conquered. This not only subdued any resistance to any future changes or whatever, but it allowed him to populate and control all areas of his kingdom. So there was very, very few times would there be any rebellion that would pop up. His empire was also built largely by slave labor. When he would conquer somebody in battle, he would bring these people back that he deported. He would bring them back to Babylon to work on building the walls, the palaces, the temples, everything that he was working on there. Not only that, but he was a pagan king. He worshipped false gods like Marduk and Ishtar and some others as well too. This was the king that brought Daniel and his friends and the other Israelites were from Judah, that brought them to Babylon to serve him. So he's not a nice Christian guy. He was a really bad pagan king. You know, this might be the last person that you would expect that God might possibly be working in their life. This, you wouldn't really expect it right off, but in Daniel 2, we see God give a prophetic dream to this crazy king. You would think maybe after studying through Daniel 1, why didn't he give that dream to Daniel? Later on in Daniel, he gave prophecies to Daniel. In Daniel 1 verse 17, Daniel understood visions and dreams, so he had a specific gift that God had given him for that specifically. And at least God might have given this dream as a prophecy to someone who was a faithful believer. But no, gave it to a pagan king. God made it really clear in Daniel chapter 2 that he is working where you would least expect him to be working. Let's start in verse 1. Daniel 2 verse 1. In the second year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So the king gave orders to summon the magicians, the mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. When they came and stood before the king, he said to him, "I've had a dream and I am anxious to understand it." He couldn't remember what he dreamed, but he knew it was pretty important. Have you ever had an experience where you've dreamed something that you really wish you remember, but for the life of you, you just can't pull that back out of your memory? It wasn't quite as important. Most of those dreams aren't quite as important as this one probably, but it's the same experience that Nebuchadnezzar was having. Very frustrated and really he knows this dream is something important, but he can't remember what it was. Of course, the magicians and everyone else that was around him, the mediums and the sorcerers and the Chaldeans, they could not tell the king exactly what he dreamed. This was only in the king's mind. If they made something up and it didn't match, they'd be in some serious trouble. Nebuchadnezzar would know right away that wasn't the right dream, but they were experts at crafting interpretations to a dream. They could hear a dream and they would make something that sounded pretty good, that matched with whatever it was, but no one could do what the king wanted them to do this time. The king threatened them with torture. If you keep on reading through the story, he threatened them with death, destruction of their houses if they didn't do what he said. But he said, oh, I'll give you great rewards if you actually do what I say. But it didn't matter what the king threw at them. These guys literally could not do what he was asking. No one could do what he was asking. Supposed dream experts could not tell him what he dreamed. In verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king, and you can hear the frustration and the fear almost in their voices. In verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king, "No one on earth can make known what the king requests. Consequently, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked anything like this of a magician, medium, or Chaldean. King, this is what's saying in much better language, this is unreasonable. Why are you threatening to kill us for something that no king would ever even think of asking of us?" What the king is asking is so difficult that no one can make it known to him except who? Except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. The Chaldeans didn't know it at the time, but they were setting themselves up for actually to be proven that they were completely true, except the gods that they were thinking of they weren't as powerful as they thought they were, the ones that they were worshiping. Nebuchadnezzar got so angry at them, he just wanted to know his dream, that he commanded that all his wise men be executed. Not even all the ones, not only the ones that were there that couldn't tell him, but every single wise man in the entire kingdom would be killed. This included Daniel and his 3 friends. This is some other level of angry, just over a dream. Again, this is not a nice guy that God was speaking to, that God was working in his life. Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, it says in verse 14, he came to arrest and execute Daniel and his friends. And Daniel has no idea what just went on in the king's court. For whatever reason, he wasn't there. He tactfully asked Arioch why the king had ordered this. I wasn't part of this. Why is he being so unreasonable with this? This isn't normal. And when he heard what had happened, he asked the king to give him a little bit of time because he knew that his God could give him the answer to this dream. Daniel didn't know the dream, but when he had a question he didn't know the answer to, he didn't try to figure it out on his own. He turned immediately to the one who he had chosen to be faithful to. Verse 17. Then Daniel, after talking to the king, went to his house, told his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, about the matter, urging them to ask the God of heaven for mercy concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his friends would not be destroyed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. Can you imagine that prayer meeting that night? They knew that their lives were on the line. If God did not show them this, their lives were on the line. They were okay with it. Either way, we know from later on it didn't matter to them whether they lived or died. They were going to be faithful to God. But they were pleading with God. And I'm sure it wasn't just for their lives. This is what's mentioned here, but the lives of probably thousands of people were on the line. In verse 19, this God that they had promised to be faithful to, that they had decided to be faithful to, came through. The mystery was then revealed to Daniel in a vision at night, and Daniel praised the God of the heavens. He went on to praise what we read during, or what Clark read during the scripture reading. Daniel rushed to the palace to tell the king of the dream as soon as he understood what it was, to save the lives of all his colleagues. But Nebuchadnezzar has a really interesting response, kind of a shocking response. This was something a king would never do to a slave. Absolutely, this would never. And I guarantee the people that were in the palace were shocked that he actually did this. It may seem a little strange to us too. We're going to go through the vision, the dream itself and the interpretation, all that. We're going to go through that next week. But let's skip down all the way to the end of chapter 2 to verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell face down, worshipped Daniel, and gave orders to present an offering and incense to him. the king to a slave, worshiping the slave, because he told him his dream. The king said to Daniel, "Your God is indeed God of gods, Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you were able to reveal this mystery." It might seem a little strange to us, but King Nebuchadnezzar honored Daniel in the only way that he knew how. He's saying, "Daniel, you have connections with the God that I have no connections with like you do." And he realized that all of his gods were powerless, the ones that he believed in, compared to Daniel's God. He called him the God of gods. In other words, he realized that this was a God that was better than any, more powerful than any of the ones that he had, and also Lord of kings. Nebuchadnezzar was the strongest king in that era in all of the world at that point. But he recognized that this God was his Lord. Now, he wasn't anywhere close to what we would call converted at this point. But God was working in a powerful way where you would least expect him to be. God was working in him and through him to reach his kingdom, to reach him individually, to reach those in his kingdom. But this story and this experience has also impacted the lives of millions of people since then. Giving confidence in the Word of God because of the prophecy that he showed to Nebuchadnezzar, and how all of this came true exactly as he said over time. And also gives confidence in a stronger belief in God as well. Here's a few lessons that we can learn from this story. Number one, God is working where you would least expect him to be. Number two, God places believers in someone's life just when they need help being pointed to him. And number three, Daniel's first response in a situation he didn't know the answer to was to turn to the only one who he knew could help him. Immediately ask God for help. God is working where you would least expect it. See, no one is beyond the reach of God. God can work in the heart of a pagan, cruel king just as well as he can work in the heart of a converted believer. Nebuchadnezzar worshipped other gods. He was about to kill thousands of people just because they couldn't tell him his dream because he was so angry. But God chose him to give this prophetic dream to. God was working in his heart. God's work is not only limited to those who believe or to those who appear righteous. Something that's very important when we are sharing God with people that are around us, it's really important to recognize and to look for where God is already at work in their lives. Even somebody that has the looks like they may be the least connected to God, they look like they've never even know the name of God almost. But God's working in their life. You'd better believe it. He is working in their life in some way. They might not even realize it. They probably don't. But before we assume that we have all of the answers and that God hasn't been working in their life, we need to look for and at least be aware that God is already at work in that person's life. We're just the next person along the way that God's brought across their path to lead them another step, even if it's just by a little bit of interaction. Number two, God places believers in someone's life at the right time when they need help finding their way to him. God had brought Daniel to Babylon for a reason. There's a lot of reasons I think he brought him to Babylon, but even though Daniel was a captive in a foreign land, God put him in just the right place so he could be at Nebuchadnezzar's life in a position where he would be respected enough to be able to help him right when the king needed guidance. Nebuchadnezzar was not able to, he didn't understand who the true God was. He didn't understand hardly anything about the true God. And so God brought Daniel into the picture after giving Nebuchadnezzar this dream. He knew it was important, and he brought Daniel into the picture because Daniel was a faithful man of God. He knew that Daniel would be a faithful representative of who God was to this king, that he would be able to lead him the next step closer to God, to be a witness to the king and to the entire kingdom. Even today, God places people that he can trust, people like you, each one of you here in this room, places people he can trust. Even if you don't think you can be trusted, God knows where he can trust you. He places you right in the path of people's lives to be witnesses at just the right moment when they're seeking for God, even if they don't really realize it. They're seeking for something about God, and they're in need of being pointed to God. He puts you in their lives right when they need it the most. As a side note here, and it's really important, but I mentioned a little bit in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel was extremely careful with how he said what he said and what he said, who he talked to about the things that he believed in. Especially in this situation, he was faithful to God's call. He was staying faithful to him. He was not compromising, but he could have easily blown it. If Daniel had been condemning or harsh to Arioch or to Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar probably would have never even listened to him or given him a second. It would have added to the anger, and they probably would have lost their lives that day. God would have had to use someone else to reach Nebuchadnezzar. But Daniel was very careful that his calling, that God's calling for him, would not be cut short by his choice to be blunt, insensitive, or indiscreet with the way that he talked about his beliefs with others. See, people who claim to be Christians, and I've run into a lot of these people, unfortunately, throughout the years. People who claim to be Christians are often some of the rudest people that you'll come across. I'm sure you've run into some of those people. And they're so insensitive when talking with people about their beliefs that when talking with someone that doesn't believe the same way they do, it's very overbearing and very blunt and very insensitive to where God is working in their life and the beliefs that they have that they're not ready completely to follow with what you're sharing with them. And sadly, this kind of attitude toward talking with other people has given Christianity a really bad name. When we think we are being faithful and standing up for what's true, but we come across way too strong or too blunt or too insensitive, we can actually turn people away from God. Instead of leading them that step closer to God, we can actually shut off, for the time being at least, their interest in ever even exploring God. We can close that opportunity. We would do well to follow Daniel's example in verse 14 of chapter 2. Then Daniel responded with tact and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. With tact and discretion. He was very clear in sharing about his God and what he believed his God could do, but he did it in a way that did not offend, that did not compromise his beliefs, but still did it very tactfully and discreetly. In every interaction we have with people, every conversation we have to remember that we are representatives of the God of heaven. We'll likely not always be aware when God brings someone into our lives who needs a little help being guided to God, and that's why the last point here is so important. Daniel's first response in a situation he didn't know the answer to was to go immediately to God for help. This is why our personal connection with God is more important than anything else. If you have an overwhelming situation, or if you're talking with somebody and a question pops up that you don't know the answer to, don't freak out. You have someone who knows the answer to everything. You turn to him immediately. Ask him for help. It doesn't mean you'll have the answer right then, but he will give you that answer when you need that answer. Don't try to figure it out on your own. Don't try to stumble and just make something up. Rely on the God who knows everything, who knows what the person that you're talking to needs to hear right then. Turn to God first. Ask him to help you to be a faithful witness in everything that you do and say in every situation. See, God cannot use you to the full extent that he wants to until you have made this settled decision to follow him. He may be able to use you in a little ways here and there, similar to how he used Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar hadn't made any decision to follow God, and God was still able to use him. But he can't use you to the full extent until you have made this settled decision to follow him. Have you chosen to be faithful witnesses to Jesus? Faithful to his character and faithful to the truth at the same time, no matter the cost that it comes to you. I want to ask you, and we're going to have some time to discuss here in a little bit, but will you commit to always be on the lookout for people that God may be bringing across your path? It might not be obvious to you. It's probably not going to be obvious to them, but where they just need a smile, a Christian to give them a smile or help them out with something or answer a question that they may have. Whatever it may be, you have no idea what God can bring across your life. I want to appeal that you always be on the lookout, even and perhaps especially when the person walking up to you or you're walking up to them looks like they have the least potential in the world. Will you watch for those moments when God brings someone across your path? Where are you ready? And are you willing to be part of what God is doing in everybody around you?